Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the links in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Carl Jha. Carl is a Chinese American political commentator, journalist, and podcast host renowned for his insights into China's history, culture, politics, and broadly speaking, geopolitics and media. Carl, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you, Jyotishman. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's get started with China's Victory Day celebration. Of course, it marks the 80th anniversary of China's victory against Japanese invasion. It also marks China's victory against world fascist forces. How would you describe the significance of the Victory Day celebration, given the Western media has largely characterized it as something anti-West and also something very nationalistic? I feel that both of it reduces the scope and scale of these world events. So how would you describe what happened on September 3 on the 80th anniversary of Chinese victory?
Right. First, I apologize if you hear dogs barking in the background. That's my dogs. They think they're Americans. They think they own the whole neighborhood. So they're very territorial. The 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism in Asia. This is a very important date for Chinese people because the Chinese people have suffered tremendously during World War II. For people in Europe, World War II started in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But for the Chinese, the war actually started back in 1931 when Japanese invaded Manchuria. So for China, it's a 14-year-long struggle for its independence to throw out the invaders. And the anniversary parade is to celebrate how far China has come in its national struggle to build its sovereignty, its independence, and also it's sort of a coming out party akin to 2008 Beijing Olympics. Right, that idea of 2008 Beijing Olympics, which wowed many people with its opening ceremony, was to show the world how far China has come, and this parade does exactly that. But it's also it's a celebration for the Chinese people themselves, to celebrate their progress, particularly in the decades following the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And this is a very proud moment for many Chinese who have watched this show. So the Westerners, they have this main character syndrome, right? They think everything is about them. Everything under the sun revolve around the West or the US. I'm sorry, this is not about you guys. This is not about you. This is about a Chinese celebration for the Chinese people themselves. But they're also very eager to demonstrate China's strength. This is also an effort of peace through strength, if you will, by showcase all the latest Chinese military hardware. I think it's having an effect because there was a recent leak from Pentagon that Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, just recently drafted a new outline which says U.S. should give up trying to contain China as a top priority, instead should focus on the West Hemisphere. And this is I think, well, of course that's not just because of the parade. That was a long time coming. That I'm sure that paper was drafted way before that. But I think the parade itself present a very persuasive argument for U.S. to give up its dream of maintaining global hegemony everywhere, but particularly in East Asia.
And the parade was preceded by the SCO summit in Tianjin, the port city of China, which again demonstrated Chinese vision and leadership of an alternative global order based on cooperation and international equality. I mean, many in the West, again, to bring that as a reference point, presents SCO as some sort of a defense alternative to NATO. My own sense is that SCO goes much more beyond that, because the idea of cooperation, as it is presented by SCO countries, is very different from that old order centered around NATO. How do you describe this back-to-back placement of SCO summit with the Victory Day, but also what marked during the SCO summit?
Well, I think SO Summit was held at a very important juncture at a time when United States under the Trump administration is basically slapping tariffs left and right against all countries, like whether serve adversary or supposedly partners of the United States. And this, by the way, also shows the difference between say NATO and BRICS and SCO. People always see them as some kind of mere image of each other. Like, okay, they're in opposition, so SCO or BRICS is just like the opposite of BRICS, which is couldn't be further from the truth. Because NATO as alliance, it's dominated by the United States. It's made to serve the interest of the U.S. empire. There's no question who the boss of NATO is. You have when you have the NATO secretary calling Trump daddy. I mean, it's so embarrassing. And all the European leaders rushing to Washington, just sitting around like school children to wait to be scouted by Trump in the White House. I mean, there's no equal partnership in NATO. And particularly with Trump at the helm. Trump just rip away all the facade of so-called partnership that was espoused by likes of Biden or Obama. Trump just says, come to Washington, bend the knee, and kiss my ring. And that might be acceptable for the Europeans, but it's a hard swallow for many other countries, and in India in particular, because India sees itself as a great power. It never has intention to be like a mere pawn in America's grand chessboard. India always pursues strategic autonomy. So when um, Trump essentially tell India to bend the knee and kiss a ring, and India said no. I mean, to give Indian leadership credit, they have much more backbone than the Europeans because the Europeans just say how high when Trump says jump. So and this is another important part of SCO is that it brought important country of Russia, India, and China together. This is why Trump tweeted, "Oh, it looks like India. It looks like Russia and India have joined the deep dark China." The guy was so jealous. The guy was just jealous he wasn't invited to the party. But the thing is, the rest of the world is ready to move on without United States, especially when U.S. is weaponizing its financial hegemony against everyone, throwing sanctions and tariff around against anybody uh, who dare to not even challenge, but to deviate from Washington's foreign policy. I mean, in India case, it's traditional friendly ties with Russia. It's dating all the way from the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and India also purchased large weapon platform from Russia, and of course a lot of Russian oil and energy. Whereas Trump wants India to cut off that relationship and to switch to buy American oil and gas, and in addition, he demands India to open its agricultural sector to allow heavily subsidized U.S. farm produce to flood Indian market, which is totally unacceptable for India because India has 60% of its labor force employed in the agricultural sector. I mean, it's out of question. And again, this is the because Trump is a bully. He perceived people he perceived that India may have a weaker hand when in a bilateral relationship with United States. That's why he thought he could bully India. But credit where credit is due. Indian leadership didn't back down, and this is why we have the SCO, and a lot of these summit, they're there for ops, because a lot of the actual negotiation has been laid out often months in advance by seasoned diplomat by the both sides. So when it comes to the summit time, they can trot out the agreement they have already agreed in advance. But those photo ops are very important. It does send a message when Modi, Trump, and Xi Jinping are holding hands together in Tianjin, and Trump is being a very sour loser, tweeting about it. So, and this is, we are entering the age of multipolarity now. It's no longer a U.S. dominated, a unipolar world order anymore, and that's just a reality. And this is something that it's a hard swallow for many in the West. But even the Western leaders have come around. You have the famous gardener Joseph Borrell, who have said, who compared the rest of the world to jungle, who have said the Western dominance, 500 years of Western dominance coming to an end. And he's absolutely correct. And you and Marco Rubio acknowledged the multi-world order is already here. So here we are. This is the SCO and the back and back victory parade. It sends a strong message. The center of the world have shifted east, and this is a gradual process. For millennium, the center of civilization lies in the east, and it's only due to the industrial revolution that center has shifted gradually towards Atlantic. And I think somebody had mapped out like the center of gravity of the world economies. You can see a gradual shift to the Atlantic after the industrial revolution, but now it's coming back. The world is coming full circles. There's a re-emergence of countries like India and China, which combined makes almost 50% of the population. SCO, if you look at SCO, the member nations have Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, Indonesia. And if you have all these countries combined, like there's 680 million people in Southeast Asia. There's 1.4 billion in China, 1.4 billion in India. And you add Russia, Iran, you throw everyone together. That's more than 50% of the world population. And it covers almost the entire Eurasian landmass. And this, for the students of geopolitics, right? Mackinder famously said, if you want to dominate the world, you got to dominate the world island. And by world island, he means Eurasia. And if you look at the map of SCO countries, they cover most of Eurasia. This is what have Western elites all riled up right now, because they see this emergence of a alternative world order and they're not part of it.
You said about the victory day that it's sometimes it's not about Europe or the United States. It can be about Asia. I guess the India-China question also has a similar element to it, because in the West, all the coverage says that it is this miscalculated sanction of 25% against Indian buying of Russian oil that has led to the normalization. I mean, there might be an element of truth there, at least in terms of the optics, but the India-China normalization had started at least since the Kazan summit in October of 2024. That was followed by a high-level foreign ministry level visit in Beijing, and then Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, visited India, followed by setting up boundary commissions, which have made huge advancements and so on and so forth. So again, I feel that, as you said, it's the fate of 2.4 billion people in Asia, at least for the two countries, but it goes beyond that. So I guess India-China, my own reading is that India-China normalization is much greater than this small historical event like the tariffs and sanctions, which are not going to stay for a very long time. It goes much beyond, deeper than that, and particularly for Indians, given we are at a much lower stage of material development, India-China normalization can build enormous cooperation in investment and trade that can lift people out of poverty and so on and so forth. So I guess for those of us looking at these events from Asia, it's all the more important to redefine these developments as something happening from within Asia rather than as a reaction to this relatively smaller, maybe not completely insignificant, but relatively smaller events like tariffs and sanctions. Your response?
I think you're absolutely correct. First of all these scheduled meetings, Wang Yi visit to India, an Indian foreign minister, national security advisor visiting China, and followed by Modi. These scheduled visits were scheduled way before Trump came out with his tariff against India. And this is because ever since the deadly border clash in 2020, both sides, India and China, have realized it's counterproductive to their priorities to concentrate their resources on this unresolved border dispute. Because for China, the priority remains on the Western Pacific, where it has to deal with the issue of Taiwan and U.S. encirclement. For India, it has more important issue of domestic development, and not and it's a big distraction for both sides to waste resource to deploy resources on a border dispute. And so this the rapprochement between the two countries already started well before 2025, and that there have been multiple bilateral meetings that's laying the groundwork for the eventual Modi visit to Tianjin to attend the SCO. And but I think what Trump did is just give a little small push. He just give it a little more little bit more urgency and impetus. But India and China, they have their for their own reasons wanted to resolve this issue and to normalize the relationship, to put the relationship on track before the border clash. So that's what really happened. And at the end of the day, India and China, they're neighbors. Neither country is going away. So they have to, as neighbors, they have to deal with each other. This is the same dynamic between Russia and China. There are a lot of U.S. national security establishment folks talking about, oh, we're going to do a reverse Kissinger. We're going to engineer another Sino-Soviet split. Well, first of all, Kissinger never engineered Sino-Soviet split. Sino-Soviet split already happened. And United States was able to leverage that split that enabled Kissinger to come in to set up the Nixon visit to China. So Kissinger can't take credit for the Sino-Soviet split. And currently there's no Sino-Russian split because China and Russia actually have their relationship on very solid ground. I think compared to before, where during Sino-Soviet honeymoon period, where it's mostly an ideological alliance. Today, the two sides, the bilateral relationship between China and Russia are mostly interest based because both sides are complementary economies. Russia is an energy exporter. China is a large energy importer. Their economy happen to be complementary, and on top of that, both Russia and China, just like China and India share a very long border, and it's in their interest to stabilize that border, so they can focus their energy elsewhere. For Russia, Ukraine is an existential issue for them. That's where their energy is focused on. For China, again, the top issue is Taiwan and pushing U.S. out of East Asia. So it's very beneficial for both sides to have a stable border, and to have an amicable relationship. So these are internal dynamic of this bilateral relationship between these countries. That has nothing to do with their respective relationship with the United States. But as I said, a lot of people, a lot of Western elites, they have these main character syndrome, so they think everything is about them. And right now, the SCO once again it shows this U.S. attempt to kind of engineering a split between Russia and China, or say polling India, trying to use India as a playing the India card to contain China. That has largely failed. These countries they're truly sovereign states, meaning they will act according to their own national interest. Unlike the other U.S. American vassal states in Europe or East Asia, they are subservient to the interest in Washington. And some even argue the government in Washington don't really work for the interest of American people either. But but the country of Russia, China, India, they are looking on the lookout for their own national interests and working out their foreign policy accordingly. And to the from the Washington's perspective, um, they see that as unacceptable. They see that as anti-Western, but really that's because they're looking at it from an imperial mindset. Because empires does not like sovereignty. Empire do not agree with sovereignty. You can only be a vassal. So that's where we are.
I think part of the misunderstanding in the West about what's happening in Asia is because they don't understand that these are as new nation states coming out very lately out of empires. There are, of course, border disputes to which each sides claim very passionately about, and sometimes there are these standoffs, if you like. But beyond that, these countries generally don't have an agenda to dominate the globe or dominate large parts of its region. Its defense, even in India, is mostly about guarding its border or some of the disputed territories that it sees as the other side claiming. The same is true for China. China is very strong on what it sees as its border. It makes no compromises, but it doesn't have an agenda beyond that to dominate something. And therefore, my own reading has been that when it comes about to international block formations or cooperations, it's mostly about trades, investments, dialogues, etc., as opposed to the West, which sees block formations as geopolitical rivalry, dominating smaller parts, power projections, military alliances, etc. And I think that's what divides the imperial bloc from those of the global south who came out of imperialism recently, have differences with each other, but don't see geopolitics the way the West sees it.
That's exactly right because India and China they're separated by the Himalayan highlands. I mean, there's never going to be an existential battle between China and India. Like the current border dispute is over some very marginal land on the either side of the Himalayas. So I mean, like they're never going to be expanded beyond into some kind of major war. In fact, both sides since 1990s have agreed to not use firearms in the border skirmishes, so not to escalate. I mean, this is a very wise policy.
Even in the recent standoff, no firearms was used. It was mostly fists and sticks.
That's correct. I mean that policy is designed to prevent a ladder of escalation, and this has kind of contained this kind of conflict to a below simmering level. I mean right now, um, mm, I mean China's position has always been we have this very difficult border dispute that's ongoing for decades, but we also have many other overlapping interests where we could cooperate on. Let's shelve our dispute and work on the easy stuff, the stuff that we can cooperate on. Now, it looks like now India is coming to closer to China, to the Chinese position on that, and so I mean that's really I think that's a good way to kind of shelve aside your differences and work and focus on commonalities. And that's another thing I think the Western zero sum mentality cannot comprehend.
Absolutely. And I guess on this front, the Chinese thinking that we can talk about the differences, but we don't allow the differences to be an impediment to the potential cooperation in all the other areas. I think the Indians are slowly learning that. And by Indians, I would mean sections of the Indian elite who, to my mind, hasn't done very well on this front, because the idea has been, oh, this is something that is non-negotiable for us, whether it's with Pakistan or whether it's with China. And unless and until you resolve the biggest dispute that you see for both sides, you can cooperate in other areas. I mean, it's not the position of the country as a whole, but it's definitely a position within sections of the bureaucracy and the elite political class. And I think gradually India is shifting towards the classic Chinese position that we have to keep the differences moving forward through dialogue. But in the meantime, we should keep cooperating in other areas that we should. Um, I want to come to the West Pacific, and particularly, I want to discuss U.S.-China relationship. There's a lot of speculation going on about the future of U.S.-China relationship, and I guess that would be one of the most important geopolitical processes going forward, if not the most important, given the U.S. would continue to be a superpower for a very long time, even though it's in decline, and China would continue to rise. Now, we've already seen the trade and kind of economic warfare that also involves technology, but people are also speculating where this would go. Would this be limited to trade and technology warfare, or would we see something like a very or indirect confrontation fanning out in Latin America or Africa, like that in the old Cold War era? Or would we even see a direct hot war, particularly in the Taiwanese Strait? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict, but if you could give a sense of your analysis about what are the different dimensions of U.S.-China relationship you think would be important going forward, that would be helpful for our viewers.
Right. I mean, the main issue in the U.S.-China relationship is that on the mind of a lot of American elite, they cannot they cannot give up on the idea that U.S. Remain the number one hegemon around the world. I mean, for the Chinese side, China has no interest to replace the United States as a global hegemon. China pursues a non-interference foreign policy, which means, hey, your business is your business. Let's just do business together. Let's trade.
Sometimes to maybe even to a frustrating level. I mean, I'm thinking about Palestine, where, I mean, we've been covering Palestine very closely for a very long time, and sometimes we even think that Chinese position being so correct on Palestine, they should be even more vocal on what's happening in Gaza than what we perceive the Chinese side to be doing. But sorry for that distraction.
No, I agree. I mean, because people would contrast, for example, the present day China versus the Cold War, when Soviet Union have provided more logistic support and arms support. I mean, even compared to present day China to say Mao era China, because Mao era China actually provided weapons and trainings for the Palestinian resistance groups. So China has been fairly consistent since for the last 40 years in its non-interference foreign policy. And this is so this way, yes, I mean, I can see people are frustrated that China is not acting the same way as the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. But China's goal was never to upend the US or world order. That's the idea that's in the Washington elite's mind, because China has been trying to work within the established international order. I'm talking about UN, ICC, ICJ, etc. And it's United States right now that's discarding these international institutions that itself has helped build after World War II, because U.S. increasingly felt constrained by these international institutions and conventions, and whereas China and Russia are trying to uphold the UN Charter, and this is why China would not, for example, send a peacekeeping force unless it's a UN authorized peace mission, right? And the China preferred channel of dealing with international conflict is through the UN, through the UN Security Council. And I completely understand why there's some criticism, particularly from the left, on why China didn't do more. But China's position has been quite consistent in terms of non-interference foreign policy, and China's what is China trying to achieve? You may ask. China is not trying to achieve global domination. China is trying to build up China. China is trying to build up a more prosperous society for its own citizens, and but even that mere fact presents a challenge to the United States, because when China grows, that means you know, when Chinese economy is set to surpass United States, well, according to the power purchase parity terms, it's already surpassed the United States. This is what makes people in Washington uncomfortable, because they're in their concept of the world. U.S. should always remain number one. U.S. should be always the top dog of the world. They cannot allow a near peer competitor to challenge the U.S. position. U.S. need to have full spectrum dominance, and this is why they can't wrap their mind around the phenomena of rise or reemergence of China. And so they see a lot of the time when the West talk about China, it's pure projection. They are projecting onto China their own very own zero-sum mentality. They're accusing China of trying to be the global hegemon to replace United States. They're accusing China of being a new imperial power, of practicing neo-imperialism in the global South. Very ironic, coming from the West. And but again, that's not what China is trying to do. China is just China is not trying to act as an empire. China is just it's just a not trying to act as a responsible nation state for the welfare of its own citizens. And I think I went off on tangent a little bit. I'm trying to remember what was the original question I was
Yeah, no,
responding to.
it's totally fine. I distracted. Maybe just skip the distraction for one more round, and we'll come to the
Sure.
future of U.S.-China relationship, which was the
Oh, right,
original
right.
question. But yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I should also qualify myself. I'm not one of those in the left who thinks that China's non-interventionist foreign policy is frustrating at a general level. I think it's very correct. It's been very helpful. I don't think what happened during the times of Soviet Union can be replicated, partly because that was on the whole a more revolutionary moment coming off of the moment of decolonization. Class forces on the whole were on the rise there. There were land struggles centered around peasant struggle where you can intervene, where you can make a distinction between the progressive side and the counter-revolutionary side, and you can make some of those interventions there. I don't think we'll live in that era, or even in the revolutionary era. One has to be very careful about intervention, because sometimes you can end up intervening on the wrong side. I mean, China has intervened on the wrong side in moments in history, in East Pakistan, in Angola, etc. But all that said, I think I might make an exception in certain extreme cases. And I see Gaza at that as one of those extreme cases. Now, I'm not putting the blame on China. All the blame goes to United States, Germany, and all those countries which are providing weapons. But as someone from the left who looks at the whole Chinese project more positively and who also knows that China does a lot of trade with Israel, in these extreme cases, I expect China to be doing more. For instance, during the summit in, was it in Colombia, I guess, where led by Venezuela and Colombia and South Africa, there were these concrete measures taken for sanctions against Israel on shipping, on dual-use goods, on military weapons, and so on. Chinese representative attended that conference, but they didn't vote in favor of those sanctions. And it is these kind of things that I feel China could do more. But that's all I'm saying. I'm not putting the blame that, oh, China should send weapons there.
I understand. I understand a lot of criticism on continued Chinese trade links with Israel. And I understand the argument. The argument is China is Israel's largest trade partner. If China could just cut off the trade with Israel, that will have a large, meaningful impact. But I would also argue that um, because Israel's main backer is United States, and US will back Israel no longer, no matter what. Even if China do go to the length of cutting off its own trade with Israel, there's nothing prevent a third party, say like United States and Europe, who will act as a third party transshipment for Israel. They will just buy goods for Israel and then ship it to Israel. And in the end, the Chinese sanction on Israel will just be largely a symbolic measure. It will just, I mean, it's I know I offended a lot of people when I said on Twitter, I say it will be a more virtual signaling than actually having an effect. But this is my position. And China, for its part, it has always supported the Palestinian statehood. China was the first state, one of the first nation to recognize the state of Palestine back in 1988, and China has always worked very closely with Arafat and many Palestinian resistance groups, and China also voiced support for the Palestinians' right to for self-defense, for to safeguard their rights, including taking up arms. I mean that already is China in at least in rhetoric terms, China has already done more for any other major powers. But I understand. I understand Gaza is a very extreme case, and a lot of people expect China to do more. But people also tend to overestimate China's power. I mean, China is not United States, which have bases all around the world. The only China only have one overseas base, and that's in Djibouti. And China simply does not have the kind of power projection into the Middle East or West Asia the way the United States currently possess. The Chinese power projection is still very much focused around its own neighborhood in South China Sea and East China Sea, and it's still far fetched to see kind of um, Chinese as entrant in the kind of the security arena in West Asia. I mean that's the role that United States is playing. For example, for a lot of the Gulf countries, United States is their security guarantor, and China is very far, and I don't think China is even will be willing to play that role that of the United States as this, for example, security guarantor to the Gulf countries. But this is an evolving situation. We're gonna have to wait and see what more China is doing for Palestine beyond beyond rhetoric support and beyond maybe providing material assistance to the Palestinians. So, but yes, the big onus, of course, is still on U.S. and its allies in Europe. These are ones who are directly providing weapons to Israel. And back to the U.S.-China relationship, United States, there now is bipartisan in U.S. Congress, U.S. national security establishment, that there is now need to be and now is a U.S. China geopolitical competition that will last in coming decades. Now, nobody asked the question why. Why do we need to be in a geopolitical competition with China? But of course, the answer is U.S. is trying to preserve its own global hegemon status. This is why it's trying to prevent the rise of a near competitor. This is why they're trying to contain China, but the problem is the U.S. empire is faced very serious resource constraint when it's already stretched too thin. It's involving a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, which is trying to wrap up, but so far unsuccessfully because it's still trying to impose terms on Russia, which Russia do not recognize, and it's still very much embroiled in the affairs of West Asia, where Israel keep on dragging it back into trying to expand its aggression against its neighbors, particularly Iran. And now that leaves the plan of pivot to Asia to contain China, which was first proposed by Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State under Obama administration. That promise of pivot to Asia remain unfulfilled simply because of resource constraint. And now there's even people in the U.S. national security establishment starting recognizing that fact. This is why they did a big push for the Trump administration, trying to wrap up Ukraine conflict through the Alaska summit with Putin, for example, so they can redirect resources to West Asia. But now this goes back to our parade, right? The reason China is dragging out all these latest military gadget on display for the world, including United States, is to tell them, hey, look, China can no longer be contained. And I think that message has been received. This is why Pete Hegseth drafted a Pentagon working paper saying let's not focus on contain China for the moment. Let's focus on our strength, which is to impose a neo to impose the uh I'm drawing a blank here, but this Monroe's Doctrine, the Neo Monroe's Doctrine on Latin America, to remain at least maybe we should aim to be the regional hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. United States currently is trying to impose a neo-Monroe's doctrine on Latin America because it's has realized the limitation, the resource constraint it faces trying to preserve global hegemony all around the world. So now it's trying to at least preserve its status as regional power, a regional hegemon within Western Hemisphere, and it's going after what it perceived as weaker opponents. I'm talking about Cuba and Venezuela, and he also matches the personality of Trump because Trump he likes to go for the low hanging fruit. He likes easy victories. He doesn't want to be bogged down in like a long drawn out quagmire. He wanted an easy victory where he can claim victory, mission accomplished. I'm a great peacemaker. Please give me Nobel Peace Prize. And this is why U.S. is sending 4,000 servicemen to sail around Venezuela, and purportedly to counter anti-narcotics operation. But we all know it's not about drugs they're after. It's because Venezuela has a world's largest oil reserve, and whenever there's oil, America felt compelled to bring democracy around. And Venezuela is incredibly resource rich. It has oil, it has gold, it has lithium, it has a lot of critical minerals. A fact that was brought forth by a recently by a Pentagon women who said as much. Basically, said the fact that Venezuela is so resource rich, it presented national security risk to the United States. I mean, what she's really saying is the fact that you have all these natural resources that we don't, that is a national security risk to us because we don't have it, because we don't have your resources. And but you actually look at how they're carrying out their secondary sanction against Venezuelan oil, it's actually quite telling because China is one of the largest purchaser of Venezuelan oil currently, and and but so but another big destination is actually United States because Chevron
Chevron
has a stake in Venezuela. And guess what? Chevron just received a waiver from
continuing.
Trump's administration. And we just had two tankers full of Venezuelan oil shipped on Chevron tankers headed to United States. And this is because in U.S. the most of the southern U.S. refineries, they are designed to process and refine heavy crude, which is a type of oil that crude oil that's produced by Venezuela. So whereas even though U.S. now is a oil producing major oil exporter, um, a lot of this is due to the so-called fracking revolution, U.S. technology in fracking. But a lot of the oil extracted from shale from between the rock layers using this fracking technology, they're the light sweet light crude, and those are the not the type of crude that U.S. refinery was set up to refine. So what United States actually do is they export those light sweet abroad, and they import Venezuelan oil to those U.S. refineries. So really, this was also a proxy war against China, if you will, because they're really trying to choke off the U.S. the China Venezuelan trade link. And the problem is because U.S. The dominance of U.S. dollar, the dollar status, the world reserve currency, and the world's major trading currency. That means a lot of companies are afraid of the secondary sanction. The secondary sanction means any countries, any businesses that will purchase oil from Venezuela will face U.S. sanctions. So right now, what's happening is a lot of these um, oil export from Venezuela to China is carried out by so-called the shadow fleet. These are the tankers are either unregistered or they assume false identity of a already scrapped a tanker, and they take the oil from Venezuela, travel to Malaysia, they unload into a different tanker and mark them as uh, Indonesian oil, then re-export to China, and it's taken in by mostly small independent refiners on the Shandong province, Shandong Peninsula of China. And these small independent Chinese refiners, because they don't have overseas presence. So that means all their customers is in China. So they don't have to deal with US dollars. So the US sanction have no effect on them. And the fact that they get a discount on these oils is more than enough incentive for them to take that risk. And recently there's even a change in the traffic pattern, whereas now the oil tankers are leaving directly from Venezuela to China. They don't even bother to stop in Malaysia. They just relabel these tanker as Brazilian oils. They just say they're Brazilian oils, and then they ship it directly to the Chinese independent refineries in Shandong Peninsula. And this is a problem that U.S. will have very difficult time to crack down because, like I said, because they don't have much leverage on these small Chinese independent refiners who don't have international presence, who don't rely on U.S. financial system, and they're going to have problem tracking down all these shadow. I think this is one reason they're sending the U.S. naval fleet in the Caribbean right now. Their purpose is anti-narcotics, but really is to monitor the kind of the oil flow to from Venezuela to China. The oil flow from Venezuela to US is fine, but they're really against the oil flow to the east. So this and again, as I mentioned, 4,000 U.S. servicemen. That's not going to make a dent on Venezuela in a kinetic situation. And currently, based on maritime traffic, it doesn't seem U.S. is sending more um, hard, sending more muscles to reinforce the current flotilla. So that means if the fourth, I don't think they're going to directly force a issue with Venezuela because 4,000 servicemen is not enough. It's going to be like another modern day Bay of Pigs operation, and instead, what this 4,000 per servicemen and these boats is served as intimidation. It's served as like a visual big stick to wave in the face of Venezuela, and it's designed to instigate fear and possibly to instigate a internal unrest and color revolution inside Venezuela. And that has been the modus operandi of US right now is through color revolution, through sabotage, through sanctions, through proxy wars. Because even they have realized that's easier to do than to do a civilization ending World War III against China in the Taiwan Strait, because that's basically what's going to happen, because U.S. currently has no hope to defeat China with conventional forces. But some of them are talking about using tactical nukes, but once you go nuclear, there's no going back. There's literally no de-escalation ladder when you use with nuclear weapon. I mean, the idea somehow that tactical nuke, maybe it's small enough that it doesn't cross the nuclear threshold to invite a strategic nuclear counterstrike. That's foolish. That's really foolish. Because what's good for the goose is going to be good for the gander. If U.S. can use tactical nukes against China, what's preventing China from using tactical nuke against U.S.? And then it's a very slippery slope from there. So I don't think that's happening. I don't think that's likely. All these talk about 2027. I actually no. Back in 2023, a U.S. admiral said a war over Taiwan is likely in 2 years. Well, hello, we still have 6 months left. Well, no, less than 6 months left now. Still have 3 months left, but I don't think that's gonna happen. I don't think there's gonna be a big blowout war in 2027. I think instead, U.S. will try to capitalize on its strength, which is through the arms of CIA. USAID has been folded into the State Department now, but through so-called soft power, and trying to instigate color revolutions to instigate instability. This is something that U.S. can do very well. They're now U.S. is now playing the spoiler role, which means if they can't convince a country to join its side as its vassal to serve as a pawn against China, well, I'm just going to destabilize you. I mean, this is what happened in Myanmar. Myanmar, for the longest time, Aung San Suu Kyi was West's women in Myanmar. They supported Aung San Suu Kyi to come to power with the hope that they would turn Myanmar against China. But that didn't happen. Aung San Suu Kyi keep on going to Beijing to meet Xi Jinping. So and when the military junta until they start to then the Aung San Suu Kyi's support start to weaken among the Western government, and then when the Myanmar junta saw that, They say, oh, okay, well, if your backer don't support you, then we don't need you either. They got rid of her. And then US saw opportunity then to support the opposition through the Myanmar civil war to destabilize the country. The US is not even trying to take over Myanmar right now. US is just trying to keep that country unstable. So China's southern flank, China's neighborhood will be destabilized. I think that will be more like the kind of the U.S. play, the power play in the coming years. That's my take, rather than a big blowout war.
I completely agree. I can't agree more because my reading from history is that the United States hasn't fought a real war, at least since the Second World War. I mean, even the Second World War, it was fought in a massive alliance of the Russians and the Chinese on ground, and one could even argue the French in Europe. But all the rest of the wars in Vietnam, it was U.S. gunships shooting on peasants, huge underdeveloped forces. Iraq was basically a walk-in because Saddam Hussein's government was so unpopular by then. Afghanistan was the same. There was no resistance forces, and these are the kind of wars that the U.S. has fought. But this, I guess, on one hand, this means that there wouldn't be any hot war in the Taiwanese Strait, and I really hope the DPP leadership either they get weakened or they change their approach to the mainland, because I don't think one nation would any people on the either side would like to settle this or reunification through a hot war or through even tensions, because these are part of the same nation. It's not fighting a different nation. The question, of course, is like how to integrate with two different systems among one nation. But I guess the second point you made on this kind of covert operations and threatening and bullying, the new Monroe Doctrine, that's something that does worry me a lot, especially Latin America, of course, because as you said, explain the Venezuelan case. And we shouldn't forget that Marco Rubio, who was then in the Trump first administration, was the Senate. He proposed a direct invasion, which then Vice President Pence and the Secretary of State Pompeo here they rejected, which eventually led to the resignation of John Bolton, the national security advisor. And this Hawk has become now the Secretary of State, and that's why even the tightening of screw not just on Venezuela but even Cuba, given the Florida hawks in the Cuban hawks in Florida, even in Colombia, in the garb of fighting these drug mafias, drug cartels, and so on. And you don't know there are plans about fighting tomahawks. And Trump likes this kind of, while Trump doesn't like maybe a direct invasion, Trump likes this kind of media grabbing thing, partly to, or greatly to distract attention for what is happening in the domestic economy. Every piece of data in the US economy is tending downwards. I mean, there is a huge restiveness among the agriculture sector. I mean, earlier you mentioned about subsidized U.S. agriculture, the Indian agriculture having to be opened up to the subsidized U.S. agriculture. I mean, part of the reason is that the U.S. agriculture is in doldrums. I mean, there is a bumper harvest according to the USDA this year in corn, but stocks are piling up because the market has been completely disrupted. Soybean has been in very difficult times because the China, major soy buyer, as a retaliation, has shifted to Brazilian soybean. The major farm fairs in Illinois this year, major agro-industrial sellers of tractors, and they have not even visited this year in the fair to sell their equipments. All the indicators on the industrial side and the job market, and not just the Labor Bureau of Statistics, whose Commissioner Trump has fired because in June, the statistics was that the labor market shrunk for the first time since the global financial crisis, with the exception of the pandemic year. But every other major private sector report is saying that there has been a massive slowdown in the growth of the industrial and service sector. The consumption sector is doing very poorly. Dollars, we can go on and on, but because of his inability to deliver on the so-called promises he made on the US economy. I personally feel these distractions on his backyard, but I also worry about smaller countries in Asia. Philippines is something which does worry me because of what it has been doing on the instigation of, and Philippines is not a country like India which should be able to resist if things go wrong. So I guess my takeaway from what you said is that the hot war is off, but it doesn't mean that it would be a stable world order, because the US would not back down and let go its power, like maybe Britain handed over its power because of the disaster of the Second World War to its, again, Western rival. I mean, this time the challenge has been coming from the opposite camp. So this transition to the different international order would be different. You have been very patient, generous with your time, but if I can just ask you one final question, I wanted to ask you, moving away from geopolitics, my final question would be uh, to ask you a little bit about your differential, let's say, experience in living in China and in the West, because you have lived in both the parts for a very long time. And I wonder, as someone having the lived experience in both the places, how would you define the difference of the two societies, difference of the two maybe political systems, maybe economic system? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about Chinese rise in technology lately. I mean, as we speak, there has been a massive smart industry technology fair in Chongqing in central western China going on, where there is spectacular display of robots, EVs, all kinds of smart technologies. And this has, I think, been a historic thing that many are not discussing a lot, because for almost entire history of Western modernity, technology is one aspect where the West has always retained its hegemony. And so people like us who look at history might talk about the significance of land distribution in 1945 to 1949 in communist China, but the other side can come in and show a picture of Shanghai in 1980 and show it to be still full of dirt and filth and broken infrastructure, saying, look how capitalism works and how the West is better. But I think for the first time, there has been a challenge, not just in military terms, but also in this lived experience of people, that the East can be better, that the East looks as much clean and spectacular in technology. So if you can conclude this very helpful conversation by narrating some of your striking lived experience in terms of the contrast between the West and the East, particularly China. Wait, hey, I can't hear you. Your voice isn't coming through.
Muted myself. I
Okay,
unmuted
yes,
myself.
yes.
So for people who have been following me, you already know the story. But for my new audiences, I was born in China in October 1976, 1 month after Mao died. So I'm the first post-cultural revolution generation of Chinese who grew up there. And I can tell you, in 1980s China was still very desperately poor compared to other countries. I mean, according to the statistic, in in China's neighborhood, the only country that was still poorer than China at that time in 1980s was Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And that's because those three countries just emerged out of decades of American wage aggression. And so at that time in 1980s, I remember all the ambitious youngins all looking to get out of the country. It doesn't matter which country, just get out. And but even so, I have a very happy childhood growing up, and there's also a sense that everything is getting better day by day by day. And
Where did you live in rural China or the one of
I
those
live
work
in
unit
Chong I
systems?
live in Chongqing, which is
Chongqing.
a big metropolis city in
Right.
southwest China. And because my so my experience will reflect the urban nights of the 1980s.
The 80s
So
were also
my
the period of the great TVEs, which was a kind of link between the urban and the rural.
Yeah, so in 1980s, still 80% of the Chinese population still live in the countryside, so like only 20% live in the cities. And at that time, there's a hukou system, that is a residence permit system, which it ties you basically to where you are born. It's very hard for a person who born in the countryside, for example, to get a city resident permit that allow you to settle permanently in the city, to allow your children to go to school there, for you to access hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So the people need to keep in mind, a lot of I know a lot of people in the West, particularly in on the left side, they think, oh, before Deng Xiaoping, China was all like a socialist paradise, and then it was all destroyed, and it got shifted to capitalism. It's not quite true. There's inequality between city dwellers and people living in the countryside, because a lot of resources were concentrated in the cities. So for people who are employee of state-owned enterprise, like my grandparents who are employed as school teachers, or as my dad who worked for the universities, they're well taken care of, because at that time each state-owned enterprise, they operate their own hospital system, for example. So when I got sick in 1980, when I contracted hepatitis A, I was hospitalized for about a month. And it was all free of charge, because it was a hospital associated with the uh,
The work unit
Chongqing.
system, the
Exactly.
Gunway.
Exactly. The Chongqing number 1 textile factory, to which the elementary school where my grandma worked at was attached to. So because through her connection, through her, I was able to, be hospitalized for the entire month, and it was all covered. But that was not available to, say, a rural migrant worker who is coming to Chongqing, right? They would not be able to access that. The reason there was this kind of almost segregation is because during the early eras in the 1950s, during the Mao's eras, there's just simply not enough resources to go around, right? Simply cannot provide the same level of quality Medicare or educational service to all the people in China. So they concentrated the resources in the cities, and because China was trying to industrialize, so they tried to provide more for the workers, right? But a lot of the rural resident got left out of that system. So
This is
one
sorry, this is
go
also
ahead.
this is something even which is sometimes unknown to many people who know a little bit about China, that the
Yeah.
Maoist China actually had to concentrate resources on the urban and the state-owned enterprises, which are based on industries, while suppressing rural prices. I mean, prices not in the classic sense of market at that point in time, but it was a squeeze because China had to industrialize. Part of it had to be confrontation with the West, because the West was very confrontational coming off the Korean War, but the Vietnam was going on, and Mao had to, industrialize rapidly. And part of it was also under the shadows of the Soviet Union and that old-fashioned thinking, all of which actually changed it during the Deng period when rural prices were allowed to rise, and that was the beginning of the prosperity in the countryside.
That's correct, because China didn't have colonies. China couldn't go overseas to grab resources. So to get the capital for industrialization, China resorted to basically squeezing the rural population of their surplus. That was surplus was redirected into the industrialization effort in the cities, right? I mean, so at that time, everybody want to be a city dweller, because you just simply you have but much better quality of life, and people, a lot of people outside don't realize that there was still inequality in that system, like, and you, like, for example, if your family is part of the Chinese military at that time, you will also gain additional privilege access to resources. I remember uh like 10 years ago, I was reading on Chinese social media. One one guy brag about, because he grew up from a military family, and he was just basically saying, yeah, back in the days when you guys don't even know what ice cream is, then we have access to ice cream because he was his family was attached to Chinese Air Force. Now I know this because my one of my auntie dated a Chinese Air Force pilot, and he's the one who is always coming around bring us chocolate issued by the. But that's how he woo my auntie, and I benefited from it. But like at that time, no other kids was getting chocolate, right? So the system itself, the Maoist system at that time was actually not equal across the board. A lot of people were kind of left out, and this is when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform. He said, okay, well, yeah, let the countryside, the farmers also derive the benefit from our system. I mean, because he said socialism is not poverty. If we fail to provide basic services for our people, if we cannot compete successfully against the capitalist society or provide the best quality of life to our citizens, then we have failed. How can we prove the superiority of the socialist system if our people continue to live in poverty? I mean, that is the reason why he introduced market element into China. But then again, I also go against the people who say, "Oh, China is not socialist because they went capitalist road after Deng Xiaoping." That's also not true because China fundamentally is not the same society as United States. In U.S., the capital dictates the politics. That's why you have tech bros from Silicon Valley, you have finance bro from Wall Street Journal that basically took control of the Trump administration. And,
Or
and
Chevron
you have
can
people
or Chevron can bring oil from
or you
Venezuela
have
even
people
if Marco Rubio doesn't like it.
and whereas in China, the capital all and the capitalists always been kept on their very tight leash by the state. Like Jack Ma is not going to be able to shape policy in China. That's unthinkable. Whereas when Obama asked Steve Jobs to produce an iPhone in United States, Steve Jobs just told him flat out, no, not going to happen. Sorry, like we don't have enough skilled labor in the United States. I'd rather go build iPhones in China. And that kind of conversation is unimaginable in China between, say, Xi Jinping and Jack Ma, right? That just does not happen because in China, the Chinese state retains the commanding heights of the economy. They control the banking system, they control the oil and gas sector, all the energy sector, and all the very important strategic sectors still
Finance,
remaining in the. I'm sorry,
including
and
finance.
finance.
There are
Yes,
huge
yes, that's very
state-owned
important.
financial.
That's why there's no going to be Wall Street types telling Beijing what to do, right? Because all the banks are state owned, and the banks in China functions very differently from, say, investment banks in New York, and the banks in China are designed to funnel capital for development in China. This is how the high-speed rails get funded. Like this will not happen in the United States because Wall Street people will do the numbers and they're like, oh, that's not profitable. and like why build a high-speed rail from, like, say, Beijing to Xinjiang, right? You're not gonna get your return on investment. But public infrastructure is not supposed to be for-profit ventures, and this is what Chinese state recognize. Also, let's also listen to what the Chinese state actually says about themselves. They say they are in the initial stage of building capitalism. For people who study Marxism,
Socialism.
The idea
Social.
is that,
You said
right.
capitalism.
Sorry. The initial stage of building socialism. Because for people who study Marxism, Marx's idea is that to get to socialism and eventually communism, you have to go through a capitalism phase, right? And actually, for Marx, he envisioned only that most advanced capitalist economy will have this transition into socialism. But whereas the revolution actually happened in poor countries like Russia and China. So China had to find its own way. And for so the idea is China right now is they're still building the initial stage of socialism, not quite even socialism, but in order to get there, they had to allow some market forces to introduce competition, for example, some market element into the economy. But state very much still control the commanding heights of the economy, and this is why there's actually very low taxes in China. Like people in China don't pay income taxes, and they don't pay property taxes when once they bought their house. And this is because the state, they already own the banks, they own the energy sector, they have other source of revenue from merely collecting say income tax or property tax. These are very major differences. And China is so really the best way to describe China is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I think I got distracted slightly from what we're talking about. So you're talking about living in China versus United States. So in general, in 1980s, my sense growing up, it was things were getting better and better. People like there were more income. I was so my dad went to United States as the first generation post-cultural revolution generation of Chinese students to study abroad. While he was studying United States, the university was still paying him a stipend because he was a university lecturer. So I'm his kid, so I will be the one who go collect his salary every month. So I know how much he was getting paid, and I can and he was getting a raise, after a while. So I know people are getting more money in their pocket, more spending money, and that was happening across the board, and there was more uh things accessible because in the early 80s, I remember China had to import almost everything. China exported crude oil to Japan and to receive chemical fertilizers and refine a diesel gasoline product in return because China didn't have its own refining capability. So China was
Also
actually
machineries. That was,
yes,
and Deng in fact came in and canceled a lot of those contracts in machineries because the earlier plan was about the old Soviet style focus on heavy machinery, and that
yeah,
was exerting a lot of pressures on balance of payment. I mean, part of the
yeah,
reason why Deng could raise farm prices was because he canceled all these machinery contracts
yeah.
coming from Japan that eased the pressures on balance of payment.
And also Deng has drastically reduced military. He cut 1 million men from the Chinese military. And in fact, all the Chinese defense industry during Deng year was on life support. Many of them were told sink or swim. So one of the top weapon manufacturer in my city of Chongqing, because Chongqing was bristling with weapon factories because Chongqing was a wartime capital of China during World War II. So you had kind of retained that military defense industry. But in the 80s, Deng Xiaoping told them, okay, sink or swim. So Chang'an armed weapon manufacturing factory switched to civilian production. Now Chang'an makes electric vehicles. Chang'an now exports the electric vehicle under the brand Deepal all over the world. Right. This is a result of Deng Xiaoping's policies. And in fact, the only way some of the Chinese manufacturer remained weapon manufacturer remain still in business manufacturing weapon is actually because of the Iraq-Iran war that happened. And then both Iraqis and Iranian delegation came to China to purchase weapons. And that actually saved the Chinese defense industry during the lean years. And but this was all to concentrate resources on economic development, and eventually that paid off. And as well as sending students abroad, like my father, Deng Xiaoping said, like we should let our students study abroad. Many of them will not come back, but even if a small fraction, like say 20% that do come back, that's a net gain for us because they will have gained an advanced now working of advanced technology in the Western societies. By the way, this is what Americans say talking about when they say Chinese people steal their technology. but it's actually happened very organically because I remember a lot of my parents, my dad's colleagues who travel to study with him in the United States. They work in the U.S. Corporate sector for like 10 years. Many of them receive U.S. green card or citizenship. But after 10 years, they start to hit a bamboo ceiling in the corporate world. Maybe there's a language skills, or maybe because for whatever reasons, because they're too Chinese. I don't know. So, but that's when Chinese economies start to take off, and they realize if they go back to China to take their expertise and knowledge, they could be anything they want. They could be founders of companies. They can be VIPs. The sky is the limit. So a lot of the
Now,
ambitious.
today, university professors are coming back from the West because they have a much better life in Tsinghua University and all those elite universities.
That's correct. I mean, that's the kind of the progress that China has made in the last 40 years. But when I travel to United States, um, I like to say, it's not that China is living in 2050. China is living in 2025. It's that US is still stuck in 1995 because I feel like there hasn't been a lot of material improvement in US since that time. Like when I first came to US in the 1990 as a 13-year-old, I was amazed. I was having my Yeltsin in the American grocery moment. When I went to the American supermarket, I was, I was amazed, right? And but then as the years went by, nothing has really changed that much. And in fact, the American economy just lurched from one bubble to the next. Because I joined the workforce in December 1999 at the very tail end of the dot-com bubble, right? And since the American economy just went from one bubble to the next, first the dot-com bubble, then the housing bubble, and now I think we're in the AI bubble, and there's like all kind of asset bubble that's been blown up because of the quantitative easing, because of the printing of dollars, and and the and I also, another thing that was shocking to me is, I know how much money I was making when I graduated college back in 1999, and uh come around the 2010, when my company start hiring a new entry level engineer. I interviewed the guy. I think he was very bright. We hired him. And then I find out he was getting paid the same salary I was getting paid back in 1999. And this was 2010, right? This is like it's like a 10 years later, a college graduate salary hasn't increased, whereas the price has gone way up. So the
And
quality of
and
life
and
in
he might have had a bigger loan behind him because of education.
Yes. Yes, yes. So in a way, the US has been stagnant, if not going backwards, whereas China has been very visually rising in the last 40 years. I have been keep on going back to China. Um, like I remember when I went back to China in 2001 and then 2010. At that time, I thought, oh, China is a great place to visit for tourism. But I mean, I would not live here because too much pollution, et cetera, et cetera. But when I traveled back in 2019, something changed. Everything cleaned up. And even in like the small cities, I traveled to a border town with Myanmar, like out as far out of the way as you could. The places are clean. Places are clean. I mean,
And
and
a
like,
lot of trees in Chinese cities.
yes, yes. And when I went back to Chongqing, maybe because I've been far away from home for so long, one thing impressed me landing in Chongqing from Los Angeles was like, wow, this city was green. I don't remember when did Chongqing is such a green city. It's very lush, and so now in 2019, my impression is, oh, this is a country I would totally live in. They're like, no, 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 not a question. And I just recently went back in earlier this year, and it after 5 years, it's even a bigger difference. Like every 5 years I visit China, it's like I'm visiting a different country. The whole infrastructure has changed. The whole landscape has changed. And it's changed for the better. change for the better. I mean, like talking about green, actually they saw the forest cover. China is one of those countries that gain most forest cover. I think the other country is Vietnam, but China, they actually gain a lot of their greenery back because it's because like now they're generating so much wealth. People don't have to, cut down the trees on the farms and stuff. They can let nature start gradually taking over. And so yeah, things are third. So my contrast between China and US is one is US is a stagnant, the old decrepit imperial core, and China is on a very fast rising trajectory. I mean, you can look at numbers as well, like electricity consumption, the electricity production. The Chinese electricity production goes straight up. U.S. electricity generation for the last 20 years is essentially flat. I mean, that is a good proxy for the economy as any.
Yes, I don't like to add anything else except that Chinese cities are also incredibly safe. My experience in the US, I mean, the worst experience I have in the US. I mean, growing up in India as a male, and I'm categorically saying as a male because women are not always safe. But as a male, given we have always had stable governments, I never had threats for my life. There is no gun problem. I mean, the state retains its monopoly. Um, for the first time when I went in the US in my late maybe late 20s or I think early 30s, I was shocked as a male that I didn't have a car, but I wouldn't be able to go out once it is dark because somebody would rob me or I don't know. Like, and China has been the exact opposite. I mean, I took out huge piles of cash because I was traveling to another country and someone told me that carry some cash uh, at midnight on Chinese streets. And I felt safer in China than even in India. I mean, I generally feel safe in India as a male, but I felt safer with that huge pile of cash in China. Carl, we'll leave it there. I feel like we can go on and on, but for the respect of your time and our viewers' time, we'll leave it there. I'm sure you'll come
Thank
back
you.
again. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
your
just
time.
invite me back.
This
I
was
love
a
to talk.
wonderful conversation.